piece she did in 2011, tracing 15 generations of the Van Dusen family, starting with the Dutch ancestor who arrived here in 1627 to operate the windmill at the foot of Manhattan. More recently, as part of the effort to help the U.S. Treasury find women to honor on its currency, Alison used her research skills to learn more about Deborah Sampson, an often overlooked hero of the Revolutionary War who disguised herself as a man to join the Continental Army and served valiantly in Westchester as part of her service. Please help me welcome Ms. Cowan.
Thank you, Mayor Thomas and Dr. Osborne, for allowing me to be part of this special July 4th celebration. Thank you, National Park Service, for doing so much to preserve our history. And thank you to all of you for making time to join us as we take time to remember one of our nation's unsung heroines, Deborah Sampson. And for those of you who have heard me sing, no need to flee. There'll be no singing. I'll stick to talking. So who is Deborah Sampson? Raise your hand if you already know exactly who she is. Okay. Well, just a few years ago, I would not have been able to raise my hand either. I was well past 50 when I finally stumbled across her name on a U.S. timeline, and I wondered who she was. Much to my shock, I discovered that she had served as a soldier in George Washington's army, disguised as a man, spilled her blood for her country, and then spent the second half of her life fighting Congress to get paid. Imagine. Each revelation only made me feel worse that I had not known all along about this courageous woman so ahead of her time. Many of you have heard of Alexander Hamilton, whose own history is intertwined with this very special revolutionary church and its former pastor, the Reverend Samuel Seabury. So I ask, how is it that history, and yes, even Hollywood, have found ways to celebrate people like Hamilton, and yet utterly overlook Deborah Sampson every time we round up patriots to make some noise about? Let's think about that together as we review what we know about Deb from the historical record. She appears to have been born 1760 in Plimpton, Mass., not far from where the Pilgrims landed. Her mom was a Bradford, fourth-generation descendant of the first governor of Massachusetts. Her dad was descended from people on the Mayflower. But that Pilgrim pedigree did not buy Deb much in the way of comfort. When she was 5, she and her siblings were told that her father was lost at sea. Today we would call him a deadbeat dad because we know he died not at sea, but in Maine, where he kept another family or two. Deb's mom was too poor to fend for her own and had to scatter her kids in other people's homes, as it was called. Deb bounced around until the age of 10, when she was sent to Middleborough, Massachusetts, to live as an indentured servant in the crowded home of Deacon Thomas, his wife, and their half-dozen sons. Deprived of a formal education, Deb nonetheless read the boys' books and quizzed them each day on what they learned. And by the time she was free at 18, she knew enough to become a school teacher for the town. So now let's think about what life was like in Massachusetts back around 1778, when Deborah was coming of age and regaining her independence. Americans had tired of English rule and craved independence. Young men were going off to war, and Deborah was one of many skilled weavers who made uniforms for them. She had a ringside seat to the fray, but was not content to just watch others go off to fight. She probably was a little jealous, too, of the freedom they had to come and go. Women, after all, were considered the property of their fathers and husbands until they were widowed. So one day, acting on her own, she made herself a uniform, disguised herself as a man named Tim Thayer, and tried to enlist. She was quickly busted, though. Her mistake was not venturing far enough from her home, and she was recognized by the way she held her pen. Scandalous, right? Women could be imprisoned for dressing like men back then, and the local Baptist church spent many months deliberating what to do about its Deborah problem before it voted to excommunicate her from the fold. By the time issued its ruling, however, in 1782, Deborah had taken matters in her own hands. She simply made another uniform, disguised herself as a man, and gave everyone the slip. This time, she assumed the name Robert Shirtliff. and she made sure to head 36 miles away from home where she was less likely to be spotted. That was Bellingham, Mass., a town that was paying a rich £60 to volunteers who helped the town meet its quota for the war. Deb presented herself for duty and was soon trudging on foot from eastern Massachusetts all the way to Washington's headquarters in West Point. Keep in mind, this was a 200-mile walk. Deb Sampson did want to fight the British, and fight she did. Not only did Deb, as Robert, see combat in the 18 months plus she served, but she was also plucked for the light infantry. This was the elite fighting unit in the Continental Army. They tackled all the most dangerous missions and took the most risk. Part of her career was here in Westchester, where she skirmished with the British and others. Remember, while hostilities with the British had eased elsewhere after Yorktown in 1781, intense fighting continued here up through Evacuation Day in 1783. So she saw plenty of action. From 1776 on, you may recall, the Brits occupied Manhattan, and Washington's forces were concentrated about 150 square miles to the north. That left Westchester as a large no man's land, or piñata, if you will, sandwiched between the two warring armies. Residents were preyed upon routinely by opportunists and dubious lawmen, actually known as cowboys, because they'd take your cattle if you let them. Deb was injured at least twice during the war, and some of those blows occurred within a few miles of this historic church. She let a doctor treat the gash to her head from a saber, but she never complained about the musket balls she had lodged inside her thigh. She was reluctant to let anyone examine her too closely. Instead, she went off and removed one musket ball herself and carried the other one that was beyond her reach inside her to the day she died. Okay, I'm sure there's some of you out there telling yourself, I'm not buying any of this. How on earth did this woman keep up this long-running masquerade? She's not Houdini. Well, you're right to be skeptical, and there were certainly other women during the war who tried to join the fray. They were discovered and paid dearly for their offenses, paraded through town as if they were harlots, not patriots. But Deborah succeeded, and here are some of the ways she pulled it off. For one, soldiers at that time did not bathe or change clothes as often as we do. They had one uniform which they rarely removed. She avoided heavy drink and carousing to avoid slip-ups that might give her away. And anytime anyone in authority came by looking for someone to jump on a horse and chase the enemy single-handedly, she volunteered. Anything to get out of the cramped quarters she shared with the other soldiers. Eventually, her bravado and model behavior caught the eye of General John Patterson, a hero of the Revolution. He made her his right-hand man, and that promotion landed Deb private sleeping quarters for the duration of the war. It was at the end of the war that her secret was in fact revealed. In June 1783, she was sent to Philadelphia, where she succumbed to a fever and was left for dead at a hospital. A doctor discovered that she was still alive, nursed her to health, and discovered that he was a she. By then, General Patterson was terribly devoted to his protege, and the war was practically over. So rather than punishment, she was given an honorary discharge. She leaves for Massachusetts, and within a year is back in women's clothing in Sharon, Massachusetts, and she marries Benjamin Gannett, a poor farmer, in 1785. They had 3 children, and she took in a 4th, whose mother died in childbirth. From this point on, Deborah is always known as Mrs. Gannett. She does a little teaching. Benjamin even buys her a schoolhouse. It is not enough, though. They can't make ends meet. Come 1802, she hits the road by herself. Well, just her and her horse, going town to town, telling her story for a small fee to audiences and sending the money home. Her talks would start out with her dressed as Mrs. Gannett in a skirt, apologizing to the crowd if she had offended them for having swerved from the accustomed flowery paths of female delicacy. By the end of her usual lecture, she'd leave and return outfitted as a soldier, showing off her prowess with a musket. The little she earned from these gigs was not enough to support her family, leaving her no choice but to keep fighting Washington to get everything she thought she was owed. Other soldiers, of course, waited to get paid too, but once the U.S. government established itself, these soldiers did receive back pay and other support. Deb had to fight for every penny. Her first victory came in 1792 when she got 34 pounds in back pay, a lump sum that John Hancock himself signed off on. It took 13 more years before she was granted disability pay of $4 a month in recognition of her injuries. That was bumped up to $8 a month 15 years later in 1818, only after she proved she was indigent, a 58-year-old grandma with $20 of assets to her name. Mind you, with these awards, she became one of only 2 women out of 80,000 soldiers who received military pensions in recognition of their service in the War of Independence. Despite these victories, not everyone had Deb's back, and Deb took flack from contemporaries over what she had done during the war. Her grandkids have in fact written that they were not allowed to discuss with her the part she played in the war. It's almost as if she wanted to blot it out. When she died, ordinarily enough, in 1827 in Sharon in her late 60s, there was one more writing of the scale. Her husband applied for and received an unprecedented widow's pension because of her wartime service. John Quincy Adams himself supported the application, and here's what the committee wrote in its ruling. They acknowledged that Ben did not satisfy the terms of the law to qualify for the pension, but nonetheless noted that the whole history of the American Revolution records no case like this and furnishes no other similar example of female heroism, fidelity, and courage. Ben Gannett, they wrote, provided himself worthy of Deborah by taking care of her all those years they were married and tending to the wounds she suffered in defense of the country. So here's my call to action for all of you on this lovely July 4th. Let's make some noise for all the forgotten, overlooked heroines in our lives. If they're women, all the better. New York City has launched a project called She Built New York City, and they put $10 million in the pot to build some monuments to women who have contributed to the city's history. Now they need your help to pick some worthy candidates. Suggestions welcome until August 1st at the website women.nyc. I also invite you to join Dr. Osborne and me July 28th when we host a longer chat about Deb here at St. Paul's. Hope to see you then, and happy 4th.